Welcome back, everyone. My name's Nolene Murray. I'm visiting you from an affiliate project in the Architecture, Urbanism, Humanities program from Johannesburg, Wits University in Johannesburg in South Africa. So it's been an absolute pleasure for me to really I've learned so much to see all your projects and to chair this session, which comes out of your community engagement grants. We're going to be seeing three today: the mean streets, noon in the city, infrastructural opportunism, now mobility for all. Great titles. And we're going to stick to the format of 20 minutes each for each presenter, and each presenter come up, and then we'll do a panel discussion at the end. So I'm not going to waste much time, but to introduce Brian Woodman, who's here, who's the Curator of Film and Media Archive at Washington University Libraries, and in absentia, Cliff Froelich, I said it correctly, who's the Director of Cinema in St. Louis. Brian, if you'd like to come up and present.
So, hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So, I'm here to tell you a little bit about Mean Streets. It's a project that actually developed out of a collaboration that's been going on for a little while between the Washington University Libraries and Cinema St. Louis. We've been doing screenings for several years now, usually focused on issues of focusing on films and filmmakers that bring voices of the people that don't normally have a voice or representation in media, especially with a focus on civil rights, largely based on the fact that the Washington Libraries has the Henry Hampton collection, Who Made Eyes on the Prize. We established a film series to sort of explore issues that related to Hampton and his work. And usually those can only be one-off screenings, like we can do, one every few months because of the resources, and we'll try to bring in a guest, and that's sort of all we do. When we found out about the Divided City project, we thought, well, maybe we can try to do something a little bit larger than just those one-off screenings. And that's how Mean Streets came about. The idea behind it being that, well, if we can actually do a series of screenings that brings together the resources of WashU in general, as well as Cinema St. Louis, we can actually reach a much larger audience and a much broader audience across St. Louis. So just to tell you a little bit about it, the idea behind Mean Streets, this was sort of our guiding statement. The revealing mirrors of both film and television reflect, both consciously and unconsciously, problems within U.S. cities, including the overt and covert racism that has long segregated our cities. So, it was very much trying to take the spirit of the Divided City charge. And as we went through this, that idea of the Divided City, we started with a much narrower definition. It was originally inspired by the idea, as you can see in the title, we thought we might be able to bring in someone associated with Martin Scorsese, hence the Mean Streets name, to sort of explore things along that line. And then we were also talking about David Simon with The Wire, and it was going to be much more narrowly focused. As the project developed, we went much broader and past that sort of initial conception. Now, this ended up being a collaboration between a lot of entities. Obviously, we couldn't have done this without Divided City, Center for Humanities, and Sam Fox, especially with all the financial support that we got. But I do also want to give a shout out to various other groups. Obviously, Cinema St. Louis, Cliff Froelich's organization that puts on the St. Louis International Film Festival, the libraries that I'm a part of, and then the Missouri History Museum, who became one of the venues. The venues for the Mean Streets series were at the History Museum and then also at the Brown Auditorium here on campus, and then various other places around town. And then lots of different apartments and programs on campus. I want to give a special shout out to American Culture Studies because they actually also helped to support some of the programming that we did for supplemental funds. And then I should also mention that the Missouri Council for Humanities ended up in the second year of this project giving a lot of support as well. So I do want to give them a shout out. So to tell you a little bit more about it, Mean Streets, it ended up being a pretty big series over these 2 years of films. It was held in 2016 and 2017 as part of Cinema St. Louis's St. Louis International Film Festival. It's a big international film festival that happens every year in November. We tried to station the screenings usually over the 2 weekends. It's usually 10 or 11 days, so you'll go from like November 3rd to November 13th. So we tried to do it on the 2 weekends, knowing that's when we're going to hit the most concentration of people that can come to see the films. And so the idea was to have a series of screenings that would touch on issues related to the Divided City, segregation in sort of broad sense, and then have it be paired with scholars, largely from Washington University, but also with participants from the films, and then directors or other people that participated in the making of the film, trying to have a conversation with an audience between all of those different entities. And then while we were doing these Q&As, Washington University Library has also tried to record as many of the Q&As as possible so that we can make a document of all the discussions that were going on between the faculty, the community, the filmmakers, and the other participants. And the role of the WashU faculty was largely to play the role of facilitators so that you could get people from the community in dialogue with people that were participants in the films or the subjects that were being portrayed, and then also in dialogue with the filmmakers. Part of the thinking being that we wanted to get voices of people that were just in the community that were coming to the screenings. We wanted to get the perspective of the people that were being represented, and we wanted to get the perspective of the people that were doing the representing, because they don't always talk in tandem. So we were hoping there could be some productive dialogue around that so that filmmakers would be thinking more about both the audience, but then also the people they're representing. The audience would be thinking about how the filmmakers are portraying the things that they're portraying, sort of unpacking a lot of these different angles. And then we also held a series of filmmaking workshops that covered various subjects we'll talk a little bit about later. The idea being to also engage the community a little bit in the production process itself, to try to encourage people to be making their own media as opposed to just coming in and watching the media that we were presenting. And then we also, in year one, 2016, we had a partnership with WashU's Common Reader and had a series of essays related to mean streets in the divided city that came out in, I guess it was fall of 2016. And then finally, Cinema St. Louis has a Cinema for Students screening program that reaches out to primary and secondary schools, trying to do screenings, both bringing them to venues and then also sometimes going into the schools themselves. So we partnered Mean Streets with Cinema for Students to also try to get these films into classrooms and with filmmakers or participants in the films to the classrooms. For that portion, faculty weren't usually as involved. It was too hard to coordinate all of that. But we were able to get the filmmakers and participants in conversation with students in all of these primary and secondary schools. So just as a quick overview of the two programs, in 2016 we had 15 public screenings, and in 2017 we had 13 public screenings. And I didn't put all of the titles here because that would be a really long list that would be difficult to read, but here's just a selection from each year. You can sort of see that the first year we had Charles Burnett, who made Killer of Sheep, which is a very famous film, that was able to come out here. We did a program on Chirac and had screenwriter Kevin Wilmot come and talk about that. And Two Trains Running was also another very interesting film. It's more of a civil rights film, a combination of civil rights and the blues, and exploring blues and segregation in the South. And then we also did a special panel with Gordon Quinn from Cartimquin Films. I don't know has anyone heard of Cartimquin? Yeah, they're a really great organization out of Chicago that for decades has been devoted to helping train people in media, especially to achieve more diverse voices and to make stories in participation with the communities that those people represent, in order to sort of diversify the sorts of dialogues going around, especially around issues of the city. And actually, one of their most famous films was Hoop Dreams. If you know Hoop Dreams, that was a Cartimquin film. Then you can see in year two, 2017, a few of the things we had were Cop Watch, and we had David Witt, who was one of the participants of We Cop Watch, come and discuss the film. And then we had For Akeem, which was a locally based film about a young woman on the north side of St. Louis. And we had a huge panel with Dajae Shelton, the woman that was representing the film herself, as well as Jimmy Edwards, the judge here in St. Louis, and a slew of the production team. That was a really good screening. Who Streets, which is a pretty well-known film now about Ferguson. We had Ferguson activists and the filmmakers here. And then True Convictions was another fun one. We had Christopher Scott. The film was about wrongfully convicted men who had since been exonerated and had actually teamed up to become sort of a detective agency to help other people in prison that were wrongfully imprisoned. So that was a really interesting discussion. You can see there that you get sort of a sense of the attendance for the programs. 2016, we got 1,683 people into the public screenings. 2017, we got 1,362, a little bit less since we had a slightly smaller program. Then we also did the public filmmaking workshops. The topics included copyright, documentary ethics, independent screenwriting, editing, and reconstructing reality. And each of those was done with the filmmakers themselves to sort of talk about these issues and unpack them with people that would go to the panels. And then we had 20 cinema for student screenings. And for that, we were actually really impressed with like how popular this was with schools. For the student screenings alone, we got 2,177 students as part of this discussion. So we were really happy about that. This is just a little representation of some of the films, some of the promotional material. So you get sort of a sense of a lot of the films here. Of these, one that I really enjoyed bringing was the Camden Love Hate. It was actually a film that dealt with issues of Camden and sort of the racial divides in Camden, but it was actually made by students themselves. We were able to bring out one of the students and the producer, filmmaker who was supervising the project and have a conversation around the film and sort of the filmmaking process itself and how students could be involved in that process. So I was really happy to be able to do that one. It's kind of close to my heart. So general results of this, our total attendance for all these together was 5,392. So we did actually get to a lot of audiences, which was nice. We ended up having 54 filmmakers and film participants able to be there for the screenings. A lot of the faculty facilitators also, we got people from over a dozen different departments, programs from around WashU, including some of the people in this room actually, I should point out, including I know Tila was doing at least one of them, several other people. So thanks to all the people who actually helped to support this in that way. And then we covered a lot of topics. As I said, we started with this much more narrow vision. As we went, we ended up hitting on a lot of things. We, of course, hit urban segregation, but we did quite a few on the prison system, the legal system, education, policing, the urban-rural divide. We ended up going into issues that even went sort of beyond that normal thinking of it being about race, so that we were doing films about peacekeeping internationally with something like The Peacekeeper, with Porg O'Malley, who was an Irishman who actually worked in the Troubles trying to create peace there, and then also has been working in the Middle East. Then also looking at pogroms in Poland, and we also had films dealing with Palestinian relations, Jewish-Palestinian relations. So we were sort of happy to try to break this out a little bit beyond just the racial angle. And then these are just the names of the common reader pieces. I want to give a shout out to Joanna Didas, Calvin Wilson, Jasmine Mahmood, Chris King, and Sylvester Brown for all contributing their own pieces to this. And those are all online so that people can read them if they would like. And one of the things I did like about where we ended up going with this is we were able to hit both St. Louis content, national content, and then international content. The St. Louis content is obviously no-brainer. These are issues that St. Louis is always dealing with. And happily, there are lots of films that were being released, such as Hughes Streets and For Akeem, that were dealing with issues around St. Louis, actually Cop Watch being another one as well. And those ended up being really fruitful, well-attended discussions that were really pretty, sometimes were even intense. But I felt that when those screenings happened, everyone in the room was engaged in committing to the conversation. We were also able to do lots of issues nationally that could still have resonance nearby, especially with things with the policing system. We tried to emphasize some films that people could see parallels between St. Louis and the other cities, such as Milwaukee, for instance, is one city. And sometimes we did things with, like, we did one that was about gentrification in Portland, which ended up being really fruitful because American Cultural Studies came on board. It turned out they were doing this summer a student project in Portland, Oregon, looking at issues of gentrification. So we just happened to have a film for them to actually start off the conversation back in November. And then that international component that sort of brought that additional angle that we hadn't really considered previously. So to just give you a few samples here, we tried to do lots of recording of these Q&As as they went on, and so I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the things that were there and discussed. This first one's just a little clip with Judge Jimmy Edwards for the screening of For Akeem. If I can get things working here.
Let me say at the outset, the sky is not falling in the city of St. Louis with respect to education. We have wonderful educators. We have very compassionate people that are educating our children. The vast majority of our children are doing just fine. But for those that are not doing fine, we need people that are willing to go the extra mile, people that are willing to invest in something different. Too often we talk about a second chance or third chance or fourth chance. We don't need those types of chances. We need a different chance, something different, something new, and something innovative. And we have a lot of organizations right here in the city of St. Louis, I think, that is doing their best. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful for our children. I'm certainly very hopeful for our community. And so we will get there. It's going to take some time. But I think what this movie does, it opens up a lot of folk eyes. Some of you probably didn't even recognize the city of St. Louis because you've never been to that side of the city of St. Louis. Some of you didn't even recognize or could not even fathom how children live. And then they come to school, and then you expect to teach them that the square root of 2 is 1.414, the square root of 3 is 1.7327. That's not going to happen coming out of the environments that they live in. So this is bigger than just education. It's about economics, it's about housing, it's about all of those things that we have to fix.
So with that clip, one thing that I like that it demonstrates is you can see, sort of hear what Jimmy's talking about and the audience he's directing it to. He's directing it largely to an audience of what they see as suburbanites, people that aren't coming into the city. And that's one of the advantages we thought we would hit with working with Cinema St. Louis, is they have a very strong, well-built-in film community, but it's a film community that has not really gone outside of the suburbs in the sort of central St. Louis corridor. And so it was a way to start engaging that audience with these issues that may not always be engaging with it quite as much. And those discussions actually tended to be pretty strong. And actually, we also we have the video of the one with Kayla Reed from doing Who Streets. That was a really powerful discussion as well, because it was actually contentious. You had people pushing back on her for the way that she viewed the police in St. Louis. And it really became a frank discussion that I really appreciate the fact that those conversations were happening. Whoops, hold on a second. We've got to get past this. Oh, jump a second. All right, another screening that we ended up doing was Gentlemen of Vision, which was a film that is about the step crew on the north side. This was a really fun screening, particularly because we were able to get the film up into Ridner High School instead of just keeping it here on WashU campus or the Missouri History Museum. And actually, Allison Carrick, who's back there, is one of the people in the libraries who worked on this screening, and she can attest that it was a crazily attended screening. It was extremely crowded, extremely passionate, because you had this combination of people from the film festival coming, as well as a lot of people from the north side coming to support their step crew. And I'll show you, we actually got the chance as part of this to have the step crew do a little performance, and so I can kind of give you a little sense of that reaction. So you kind of hear from the audio there that the entire thing was maxed out the entire time. Like the audio was actually terrible because of the amount of excitement in the room. But yeah, it ended up being an amazing performance to hundreds of people, where then there was also a discussion between the filmmakers and then the man who heads the step crew and sort of talking about its role in St. Louis and for that community. Then finally, if I can get to it, whoops, hold on a second. Let's skip it. One nice opportunity that we got out of this was we were able to do just a couple of oral histories as well. We did a program on Pruitt-Igoe, and we were able to bring in a couple of the people that were in the film More Than One Thing, a film that's in the libraries, and actually do an oral history with them, which has contributed both to the library collection, starting to collect more on Pruitt-Igoe, which we really appreciate. And I probably don't have time to show the clip, but it's gotten me thinking more about how we need to start expanding these oral history programs, and when we're bringing in people from around the country, how we can be building oral histories on St. Louis-related issues with people that are from outside of St. Louis. Are you sure? All right. So this is just a little clip. I actually edited this together with some images that we had of things related to the filming. So it's sort of like Billy, the boy in More Than One Thing. This was a film made in 1969 with a filmmaker, Steve Carver, from St. Louis, who they basically teamed up and made this film together about Billy's life in Pruitt-Igoe. And so we now have this film available online for people to see. But we were able to bring Billy in for the discussion. We actually recorded the Q&A with him, but then we also did a separate interview with him and his brother Tommy. And then this is him talking about the filmmaking process with Steve Carver.
I was about 50%, as it was, he was 50%. And he would ask me to record how would I do this today. I had some of the stuff back I was supposed to bring, but I said I'm gonna haul all that stuff. I remember taking notes about what I want to do on the play basketball, swim to the pool, and we did all of those things. And basically he didn't go by my agenda. And if you notice in the movie I was talking, I was saying, I want to be somebody. You know, that's why I try to do everything. Play, you know, do this and that. Do more than one thing.
There's so many things when I speak. I would have to the electrical song, football song, track song, film song, movie song. There's so many things, right?
And when we do the movie and everything stuff, and I heard myself say that, I said, that's the name of the movie right there, Steve. He said, what? I said, More Than One Thing. Because I want to do more than one thing, so that's the title. We would review our shots weekly, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, when we got closer to the end of the production. And I looked at him and said, what do you think about this stuff? And he really was open-hearted to give me chance to rebuttal anything. He was very good about that. He didn't just not put me into the action, so to speak. He wanted to make sure that I was satisfied with the way everything was formed.
Were you satisfied?
I was more satisfied because this man treated me like a little brother, man.
So one thing I like about being able to do that interview is it gives a picture into the actual production process itself, and also a mirror of how you can actually do the production process in a way that's collaborative with the person that you're doing it with, and how both people came away from it feeling really positive. And happily, then went on to do a much longer interview from there about all sorts of aspects of Pruitt-Igoe. So I'm going to run out of time here. So just to quickly, let's see. Yeah, as far as the challenges, we definitely had logistical problems. You can imagine doing this many screenings in a period of a couple of weekends was intense, especially trying to schedule people coming in. But luckily we had the infrastructure of Cinema St. Louis, which helped a lot. Then outreach across communities. The one thing that we are aware of is that Cinema St. Louis has its community. WashU has its community. We were able to really break into those communities a lot, but to break into more St. Louis communities, it required sort of targeting each screening to that community, people that might be interested in it. Like if you're doing a film about the justice system, you have to get to the people that are interested in that topic, which takes a lot of time and trouble to actually do that sort of targeted approach. Also, access to screening venues. You probably noticed if we did the History Museum when we did here, we're doing the Central Corridor again. There aren't screening venues on the north side. So one thing we'd like to do is try to develop that more. And then I've also been thinking some about whether in some ways this is still too passive an approach in the discussion. Something about putting people up, on a stage to talk to the audience is still having a sort of a barrier. And it'd be nice to build in some way of actually having it be more of a dialogue discussion around a table. But that would, of course, create problems. So, for a future expansion, I think we need to work on these school community group relationships so that we can get the films actually not just in the central corridor as much as possible. Ridner was a good example of when it worked. I think it would be a good opportunity to expand these oral history programs so that we can actually have that on lots of topics and getting these perspectives not just from St. Louis but outside of St. Louis. I think it would be nicer to also have the guests have that closer relationship instead of it just being that more passive, you watch the film, you can ask a question, but no one's part of a real conversation. Change that structure. And then it would be nice to find a way to include community members in the production process, not to just have them go and learn about filmmaking and then talk to filmmakers, but also make something themselves during the film festival, which logistically could be tricky, but with resources here in St. Louis, it could also be very doable. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Here's my information.
Thank you very much, Brian, and we'll of course have opportunity to ask you questions just now or later. I think that's a term that South Africanism just now, isn't it? I'd like to now introduce the Noon in the City project, and Rosalind Early is here to present it. Her partner Gerald Early is not. Oh, he is here. Is it? Oh, not. Sorry, I don't. He is an absentia, is he? So welcome, Rosalind.
Thanks. Okay, you should be able to just press play and then make it big there. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to describe a little bit about our project. I'm working on a book with my dad, Gerald Early, called Noon in the City, the Odunde Festival and its Challenge to Philadelphia. And for our project, we did research for our book, and we also partnered with Tina Morton and Naomi Richardson, who are working on a documentary about the Odunde Festival, and I will show you a clip of their documentary at the end of my presentation. So, first of all, what is the Odunde Festival? Odunde means Happy New Year in Yoruba, which is a West African language, and it's also the name of a religion and of an ethnic group. And it's also an African American festival celebrated annually in Philadelphia on the second Sunday in June. So it begins with a procession to the Schuylkill River, where the faithful make offerings to the goddess Oshun, who is represented by the river. She's often represented in flowing bodies of water. And people make offerings of honey, fruit, and flowers. Oshun likes very sweet things, and she is the goddess of love and beauty. So after the procession, there are concerts and dance performances throughout the afternoon, and there are vendors hawking everything from Brazilian food to Obama t-shirts, and generally the festival attracts 30,000 revelers or more, and it is one of the longest running and the largest African American festivals in the country. So Odunde began Odunde's founder, Lois Fernandez, got the idea for the festival in 1971. And she took a few weeks off of her job with the city of Philadelphia to travel to visit her sister Madeline, who had married an African freedom fighter in Tanzania. So she went to Tanzania to see her sister. And while she was there, she decided to also go to Nigeria, which is one of the homes of Yoruba. So around this time, Fernandez had already been radicalized by the civil rights and Black Power movements, and she was one of the first Black women in Philadelphia to wear her hair in the natural style, so she no longer straightened her hair. And she also had started an African art and clothing store called the Uhuru Hut. And her sister had married a Yoruba priest and started a Yoruba temple in their neighborhood of South Philadelphia. So she was in Africa, she traveled to Nigeria, and where Yoruba is practiced, and she went to Oshogbo, which is where the Oshun Festival happens every year in August in Nigeria. So a little bit about Yoruba. So the religion recognizes one supreme being called Olodumare, and there are hundreds of intermediaries known as Orishas. And people pray to the Orishas for blessings. You don't pray directly to Olodumare. And Oshun is the goddess of the Odunde festival. She's one of those Orishas. And when Lois headed to Oshogbo, the city that's important to the Yoruba tradition, she met the Nigerian artist Twins 77, who took her to the Oshun River, which is where the Oshun Festival happens. And she says she tasted the waters and they were sweet. Something happened to me when I tasted the water, she said, so much so that 3 nights in a row, he had to take me back to the river. He also showed her pictures of himself at the Oshun Festival, and Fernandez immediately thought about the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. And that was the beginning in my head about what we could do in Philly, she said. So a few years later, in April of 1975, a small group of people made the first procession to the Schuylkill River. And at that point, they called it the Oshun Festival still. And Fernandez recalls it as, I told my sisters and my neighbors that we were going to have this festival on South Street. And at the time, she was a member of a group called the Women of Southwest City Center, which gave her a $100 grant to do the festival. And the members were also the festival's first vendors selling home-cooked food and other items. We were just one block, 2200 block of South Street, Fernandez recalls, and it was wonderful. So the following year, they renamed the festival the Odunde Festival and moved it from April to the second Sunday in June, where it has stayed since then. And within 2 years, the Odunde Festival had gotten really big and quickly spread over multiple blocks in the city. And it was this really great accomplishment for her, but the neighborhood did not want it. So a little bit about the neighborhood where Odunde takes place. So Fernandez grew up in South Philadelphia, around 6th Street and Snyder Avenue. And her father worked for the gas company and was an adherent of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. And she grew up there with her 8 brothers and sisters. And this ward of Philadelphia was at the time primarily black. It was integrated, like the 7th ward was mostly black, but neighboring wards also had a large Italian and Jewish population. But South and Lombard streets for almost their entire lengths, from Front Street to the Schuylkill River, had traditionally been black neighborhoods and are the oldest black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. It was the part of the city that the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois did a famous study in, and he wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899 about that area of Philadelphia. South Street was so famous as a black neighborhood that it was specifically mentioned in songs like Lou Rawls' version of Tobacco Road and James Brown's Mind Power. And a local black R&B group, the Orleans, had a hit record called South Street back in 1962. And 2 black writers, David Bradley and William Gardner Smith, wrote novels entitled South Street. By the 1960s, though, blacks had been removed from Lombard in an urban renewal project called Society Hill. And by the 1970s, blacks were being removed from South Street. So gentrification became a tide, and according to Lois, by the 80s, it was rolling. And Fernandez remembers the whites were making their move then to try to move Odunde because they were getting a real foothold. Fernandez recalls going to a meeting with the neighborhood residents, thinking she was going to talk about Odunde. Instead, she was presented with a signed petition demanding that she move it. By then, the festival had spread over 10 city blocks. So most of the festival has been going continuously since 1975, and most of those years, Fernandez has been fighting with the neighborhood to keep it there. And there have been many, many years where the city has asked her to move the festival, and she has refused. So there are a few things that we kind of are trying to get at in our book project about the importance of Odunde. So the timing of the Odunde Festival places it squarely in the midst of an African American movement to authenticate identity through African ancestry. Oftentimes, Africa was co-opted and reimagined for such purposes. For instance, in 1966, Kwanzaa was created. The holiday is based around the 7 principles of African heritage. In 1970, Oyotunji African Village in South Carolina's Low Country, an entirely African American and Yoruba community, was created. And there was also a proliferation of other African American festivals and holidays in major cities across the US. They weren't all necessarily related to Africa, but Harlem Day, a festival to preserve Harlem's cultural history, started in 1974. The Black Pride Festival in Washington, D.C. began on Memorial Day in 1975. The first Black Cowboy Parade in Oakland, California, which celebrates the legacy of Black cowboys, also began in 1975. And the following year, Negro History Week was changed into Black History Month. So Odunde was born from the same impulse. The festival means pride, says Fernandez. People tell you that. They say, at least I know who I am. It taught me to note that I'm an African and that I need to be proud. So Odunde doesn't just create an identity for Blacks, but also offers a civic religion and public memory, a way for Black Americans to create a usable past. But more than anything, Odunde is about reclaiming a neighborhood, which is why we decided to apply for the Divided City grant, because it's really about Fernandez trying to hold on to South City. My neighborhood has changed, and it's very sad for me, says Fernandez, because when the children grew up, everybody knew everybody. Your children go around the corner and you have no worries. That's gone. We've lost it. But Fernandez keeps holding on to that neighborhood, first with Odunde and then with Oshun Village, a project she spearheaded with help from local music mogul Kenny Gamble. It provides low-income housing for seniors who were being priced out of the neighborhood due to gentrification. Fernandez used to live there. She passed away this year. And every year on the second Sunday in June, she would head out in her wheelchair to hold on to the streets that she grew up in, not so much to celebrate her ancestors coming from Africa as to celebrate her own heritage in South Philadelphia. So for our portion of the project, Gerald and I visited Nigeria to learn more about the Oshun Festival and to learn more about Yoruba. So the Oshun Festival is 2 weeks of festivities in August in the city of Oshogbo. And the festival culminates with a procession to the Oshun River. Thousands and thousands of adherents follow an Orugba, or virgin, down to the Oshun River, where there is a sacred grove, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is filled with shrines and statues of different Yoruba deities. And it's just really this amazing sacred place. You can't feel it as much when it's full of thousands and thousands of people, but it's really amazing. And people drink the water of the Oshun River and bathe in it and make offerings and have their futures read. So there's also actually a division in Nigeria about the sacred grove. So it has blocked off the river, and it keeps the people who live in Oshogbo from using that land for farming or from using that portion of the river for fishing. So there was an attempt to burn down the sacred grove in Oshogbo to open that land back up. But now, ever since the land has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's been less contentious. And plus, it draws hundreds of thousands of people there every year, so it does bring in some money to the area. So also, we partnered with Tina Morton and Naomi Richardson, who created a long documentary, and they also made a shorter one with their Divided City grant money. I don't have time to show all of it, but I will show the first 10 minutes or so of it, maybe 9, here, so you guys can take a look.
he took me, he said, I'm going to take you to Oshun Shrine. And we go to the river where they were restoring the shrine for Oshun because of river and love. And it was just mind-blowing to me. We were right by the river, able to go real close to the river, was able to reach my hand and touch the water and bring the water to my mouth, and the water tasted real sweet. And he said to me, he told me that they had a festival there every year. And I think it takes place in August. So they call it the Oshun Festival. So I said, wow, that's wonderful. Then we had back up my mind. I said, like, we're where I lived in Philadelphia. We're between them. So that was 1972, January 1972. And so I tried my best to convince my neighbors and members of our group that this was going to be a cultural event. And that I felt that we were going to come to our community, to the young people, from a cultural vein that they would respect culture.
Well, Doom Day came at this point when it started in 1975, when it was sort of like kind of the end of the civil rights movement. I think it was a real big deal when it started because not because so many people came to it when it started. You had to build up an audience with anything else. But because it was the first kind of thing that I can remember, and most people tell me they can remember, that was really so specifically African, that you were invited to come out and celebrate your African consciousness, and you were told to wear traditional clothes and this sort of thing. And that was the real breakthrough. I mean, that was the real first to have something like that happen in Philadelphia, where you were being told to get in touch with, or get back with, or reimagine yourself as an African. So I think that was a major breakthrough. I mean, there were other kind of African American things that went on, parades, the Elks and all that kind of people had all kinds of different stuff going. But this was clearly a break from all that kind of stuff. This was clearly something very different. I think in that way it was path-breaking. While you were coming to it, it was kind of path-breaking because it involved a ceremony around an African-based religion, Yoruba. And I don't remember any other event in my growing up in Philadelphia that involved you going out involved with some kind of African religion. I mean, if you were doing something, if you were either doing something in relation to Christianity or, Islam, if you wanted to try to be a little different, but, something that was African-based like this, and you're talking about Oshun and all this other stuff, Orishas and all this other kind of stuff. Well, this was very different. So I think in this way, it was kind of revolutionary in this way, what it was doing, to try to inculcate in Black people's minds as citizens that they should devote a day to celebrating being African.
I've been Black African 25 years, and I have lived in my house 78 years.
And that means all your life?
All my life, even though I'm only 39 plus.
Okay.
Well, I remember my mother and father telling me when they put this house in 1923, there were only 4 Black families in this block. Mm-hmm. And then little by little, the whites decided the homes were too big for them, so they moved out, and then the whole area became Black for a long time. Now, can you believe a house across the street about a month ago was sold for almost $300,000? Can you believe that? If I'm going to be spending that much money, $200,000 or $300,000 for a home, I want space, right? We get some.
Okay, so the rest of the movie talks more about the problem with gentrification, but I wanted you guys to see a little bit, get a taste of what the Odunde and Oshun festivals are like, which were shown there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosalind. Our last presentation is called Infrastructural Opportunism, Now Mobility for All. Matthew Bernstein is going to be presenting this, and I think his partner Linda Samuels is not here. Am I right? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, Linda. Oh, sorry. Oh, it's Penio. Oh, so there's, Linda's not. Yes, sorry.
That's right. Sure.
And then you have a video too, right?
We do.
Yeah. We minimized it. So. Is it on Chrome? It's already open. Okay. Here we go. That's your presentation.
Okay, give me 2 seconds to grab it.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Bernstein.
And my name is Penina Laker.
So we are part of a tripod. Linda Samuels can't be here tonight or this evening. She's doing research, and then we were joined by Brian Arias, who's a research assistant in the Sam Fox School. So as you heard, we retitled ourselves to Mobility for All by All. And that really became part of the link and sort of synergy throughout this. And so you'll start to hear the threads of why that came about as we go through this. This came about as a provocation we saw with the North Side, South Side extension. So we were looking at all the ways in which the planning and thought around the extension of the North Side, South Side is being brought into St. Louis. As planners and designers, we know that the plans that are made now are going to affect the implementation, so we saw this as the right time to start to think about how this evolves. The current plan, sort of the baseline assumptions that we took into place was we were going to accept the line, we were going to understand where it is, and we were not going to try and go through the technical expertise of debating whether the line was correct. But our investigation was to look at all the people that will be affected by the line. More than just the transportation, we know that this will dramatically transform St. Louis if it comes to bear through 23 neighborhoods and have the effect of bringing in billions of dollars of investment.
Yeah, and given how massive this investment is, we kind of asked ourselves how much time or how much effort was being put into really understanding and capturing the interests or the desires or the needs of the people really that are at the very core of where this line will pass. So we started thinking about like who are the people that will be affected, say at the station locations, who are the people that sort of reside within that 1 mile radius of where the line will pass, and what are their thoughts on what this investment will bring. Do they have desires and hopes for what that will mean for their future? Do they really care at all? Or so we started thinking about those sort of like ideas and wondered what kind of team we could put together to give us the opportunity to sort of like wrestle with what approaches might be most appropriate to engage with those people, and better still, where do the opportunities lie for that sort of to become a potential model that that perhaps the people that are investing in this large infrastructure investment could potentially apply or think about as they sort of go ahead to engage with people. So as you can see, we spent a large chunk of time just trying to identify who those parties were, talking to different people, and some of you are in this room. Liz Kramer in the Office of Social Engaged Practice offered some advice, and thankfully with the grant we were able to sort of like broaden the scope of what that meant, and came up with what we believe became this truly interdisciplinary team of designers, writers, researchers, activists, as well as transit advocates. And we just sort of set out and we got started.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting. You see the tangle of how all of our disciplines weave together. And it was important for us to identify organizational partners. So the two that were essential to us were CMT and bi-state development, because we saw this not only as a research provocation, but as a way to influence or sort of be additive to the process of the development. So we knew that there were professional practices that were doing the technical studies and understanding that through their trade, but we wanted to add in and layer in the conversation of alternative metrics, which you'll see, but also voices of people along the line.
Yeah, so we kind of looked at this through 3 main phases. And it's interesting because so in the earlier session at the end, Jin kind of posed an interesting question about how it seems like these grants, granted, we applied for a community engagement grant. We ended up pretty much doing community engagement, curricular infusion, as well as research, because there was just like no way we could tackle this issue just from one lens. So we sort of set out to look at this through the metrics phase. Like Matt will talk a little bit more about what alternative metrics look like, looking at how we can engage the communities that are in question, and also where the opportunities lie for us to bring some of these conversations into the classroom and just leverage that as a perfect environment to sort of tinker and just like sort of broaden that conversation through the larger WashU campus.
Yeah, and just to, not that everyone is unfamiliar with this topic, but we do have an existing system that is not built around where people actually exist, and there's still some safety concerns that are evolving, and ridership is down over the last couple of years. So it's an evolving trend that we want to tackle and sort of hear from people on the ground as to why they don't currently ride transit or use it as extensively as they could, and then what sort of things might they imagine in the future for public transportation in St. Louis.
Yes, those are the three phases. And so we spent some time over the summer just really asking ourselves, okay, so we have this amount of money that in a lot of ways can only go so far or be stretched so far. And so that meant that we could only afford to focus on just like specific locations. So we knew we have some funding to potentially focus on 3 locations, but how do we go about determining what those sites are and what those locations are? Because we didn't want that power. We didn't want to be the ones that were deciding that. So we spent some time just engaging with our partners and potential community organizations, and this part of the process became really crucial. It took about maybe 3 to 4 months to just sit down and we wrote out this comprehensive document that sort of became this memorandum of understanding that would be a binding document between us and the community partners that we would engage with. And that document forced us to articulate what truly our ask was. I think from a research perspective, sometimes it's very easy to come at that from a selfish place where I'm interested in this topic because I'm in academia and this is what I love to do, but what really is going to make people care about what you care about? So that document really became a way for us to articulate the ask and also just like think about what we were bringing to the table and what the partners would bring to the table and how we can bring everyone to this sort of even playing field. So that, anyway, that document, we don't have shots for that, but it was this comprehensive, almost like 5-page document that we took some time to really write and get feedback from our partners and sort of sign off on. So the locations that we decided to focus on was sort of inspired by a couple of things, but our conversations with some of our transit partners, we found out that the plans that they had for engaging the communities on the southern side of the line, for example, were not going to happen for a while. They were like in phase 2 or something. So we knew that we wanted to make sure that we take some time to really find a location on the south side. And I think it was important to find locations on the north side as well. We tried to focus on locations that they had not yet engaged with, because I think a very common narrative, especially when it comes to underserved communities, is this tendency of those communities just time and time again, just like being overly surveyed, overly interviewed, and just totally exhausted. So we wanted to pay attention to be sensitive to that. So we decided to focus on locations that had not yet been engaged on this particular issue. So at the end of the day, these are the 3 main partners in the community that we chose to work with and who also chose to work with us, because we wanted to make sure that we put out the invite and that they did want to work with us. So we worked with Antoinette Carroll, who I'm sure a lot of you might know from the Creative Reaction Lab. Alex Gerber is a new visiting assistant professor in communication design whose research work focuses on speculative design. So she partnered with Umema Houston, who just founded a new local social enterprise called Social Impact Project, where she teaches young youths between the ages of 10 through 20 how to sew. And so the two of them came together to sort of think about ways they can put together a project to engage their audience on issues around transit. And then Sunny Hutton from Dutchtown South. So we pretty much, once we identified the partners and sort of told them a little bit about what the larger goals were for us and how we wanted to really find strategies to capture the sense of the agency of the residents in these areas, we pretty much just let them sort of like define what that would mean. So they took what we're asking and rewrote, came up with language, posed questions that they felt would be appropriate for the audiences that they were engaging with. So Antoinette Carroll worked with a group of 5 African American college students that reside in the Kings Highway Fairground area, and they wanted to ask this question of what transit could do to improve your life. Alex and Umeme focused on the futuristic aspects of transit. So if we strip away any of those variables that we know exist and just allowed ourselves to imagine an alternative universe or world, what might transit look like? And it was really appropriate because they ended up working with a group of young people between the ages of 8 through 12. So it became a truly exciting audience, and in actuality that audience will be the future riders of this transit because it's like about 10 years out, maybe 10, 15 years out. And then Sunny decided to ask where transit will take you, and they took on a hip-hop freestyle approach that is a language that is very common among urban youths in the Black communities because it's like a way of expression. So we'll walk through each of these really briefly and show you what came out of them. So Antoinette's group decided they have this 10-week program, which is this community design apprenticeship program, and through that program, over the course of 10 weeks, went through training on how to engage audiences, how to use empathy. They talked about racial equity, talked about mobility, and at the end of the 10-week program, they put together this sort of intercept sort of event at the Boys and Girls Club in North St. Louis. And it was very interesting because when I went to the event, the first thing I realized was, how does a group of 5 gentlemen come up with these beautiful flowers on note cards? And I guess I just didn't expect that when I walked in, and I remember they were smiling at me and thinking, think about it, we're almost getting into the spring. The flower symbolizes a change of tide and a change in time. There's going to be a potential transition with this new transit line. So why not bring the beauty and the flowers and the colors into this narrative and get people excited to engage in these issues? Because they were intercepting people while they were going to their basketball games, taking their kids coming out of the gym. There was so much activity, but it was interesting to see how people would stop and smile and engage and write, and just became such a beautiful exchange. So that was really humbling to see. Alex and Umeme, who were dealing with futures of transit, just allowed these young people to think about ways they could just like reimagine what transit might look like in the future. And they came up with some phenomenal ideas that were quite interesting. And in this particular world, transit requires the only way you can move from one place to another is to be strapped into these boots with your friends. So you have to physically hop from one place to the other. And it sort of like reinforces this idea of how I think there's something communal about traveling and like moving from one place to the other. And they love the idea of being able to have a space and a place where they can travel together. So it's really beautiful. And what happens when you strip the option of land? Why does transit have to only be on land, right? So what happens when we can, fly from one place to the other and be able to leave St. Louis and see other cities and explore? You had an interesting point about this.
Yeah, and just coming up in conversation, the expansion of high-speed transit, the Hyperloop, the sort of provocation from St. Louis to Kansas City of of collapsing space and time, and this really brought that out, and they were speaking about that while they were talking.
Mm-hmm. And this last idea that made this beautiful quilt of what happens when you sort of like have self-driving cars and you completely take away the driver from the picture and just like have a space where you can just like travel without the worry of having to learn how to drive, and you can just like move from one place to the other. So what was beautiful about these quilts was they put together this beautiful exhibition, and the quilts became a way to provoke the audience to think about what transit could mean, and they had people come and engage with the quilts and see what they had done, and it was great because it gave people in the community just like the freedom to think outside the box. So it was really great to see that. And then the last community engagement event that happened in Dutchtown South used the art of freestyle, and they worked with a group of local visual artists and videographers, and they just went out on the metro, on the buses, or the bus stops, and engaged with people just like right on the spot, came up with just some beautiful lyrics. We have a short video for that. If I can find it.
Yeah, Mr. Road. Sitting on the metro, feeling like let's go. Not a whole lot in my pocket, no money but a metro. So I get a ticket, see what I think. Try to make a connection, I might catch me a link. Go to Union Station and maybe the Civic Center, see what my family get into. Ask a couple questions about the city, see what's on their mental. Then write it down whether you know or pencil. Whether I would bang a cappella or still instrumental. Make it plain and simple. Really good, like it's 11:32. I'm losing no train. We go pleasure, man. Yeah, you from around here? Yeah. Yeah. The ride public transportation for you take public transportation? Oh yeah, all the time. I use it every day. How long have you ride public transportation? I've been in 60 years, so I say at least 30, 40. At least 30, 40 years? Okay, so that seems to be a official stuff if you stuck with it this long time. People here voted to tax you a little bit more to get a metro line from the south to the north and the south via Jefferson. So I believe that with a proven hand to generate money. That's better like getting the trolley up in the woods, man. So third person? Anything around on the logo is beautiful. Because I can still work my business and still get around. Yeah, that's really cool to see. Like straight entrepreneur, own business, and you take the public transportation because it's the most beneficial when you can use it. That's real. I enjoy that. So you think just as much as it's a good thing for mobility, it could possibly have some drawbacks? More money, more problem. Just the people that are here most of the time are sitting here drinking the beer. Yeah. And not waiting on the bus, they're just sitting here enjoying it until they get home. So you think anybody out here sitting here drinking beer just waiting on the bus? And that just tells people to come in here. So maybe security or something? Security, okay. Make it a little safer. Make it cheaper. Got any idea how we can make it better?
I have
3 buses.
I guess 32 and I guess the Chippewa.
Oh, what they do is they make you run for the buses. You know, how you try to get another bus to catch another bus, they used to give you a lap of time, but now like soon as you get about here, the 20 will be done, and the Chippewa be just
about to leave.
Take off.
So you got to do
something. Give you least about 3 minutes.
I agree with my previous fellow that I was just talking with. It's possible that it could be a gift and a curse. However, I don't really think that mobility is ever a curse. Anything that happens, whether good or bad, was pretty much going to happen. It was just going to take time, one way or the other. Eventually, whether it was 1 year or 100 years from now, that line was going to happen. that method of mobility was going to happen. So, better sooner than later, because the sooner you do it, the quicker you can get the kinks out. Yeah. Did you make these? Well, how you doing? My name is Lewis. What's your name? One String Johnny.
So what's really nice about that, that's sort of like a little snippet of what's hopefully to come. So the videographers will be taking that content and will hopefully be expounding and adding onto that and making something that's unique. And I always think about how that's an outcome that I would never I could never have I could never have forged that. Like I don't even know how to start getting to that point, but by giving the community partners we worked with just the freedom to do that, they were able to take that and come up with some really radical ideas. Something that we did task with all our community partners was to think about ways that they could take these responses from the community members and either create something sort of like spatial, but think about how you can take the outcomes of those engagements and disseminate them back into the hands of the community and into the hands of the public. So each group had to think about what that means. And so for this group, in addition to the video, which they plan to also screen for the public, they partnered with Perennial and created these beautiful chase tables, and right at the intersection just had this experience where people could come and just for a day just engage in issues around mobility and transportation. So now Matt's going to talk a little bit about the metrics and coursework.
And I'll do it quick because I saw the minute flash. So part and parcel of the community projects was to put some dimensions around statistics. We focused on the sort of impossible. Look, how do we measure the immeasurable? We know that there's a variety of ways to think about statistics, and there's diagnoses and sort of all of these indicator projects that say this is a problem, but it's usually one-dimensional and sort of focused on one specific aspect. We saw this as a way to try and integrate a lot of these. We used 3 particular partners: Iris Patton, who is it's a University of Arizona, Eric Zensi, who is part-time here and developed a GPI Plus, which I won't get into, but we started from this framework of looking at 6 core indicators, layered in our transportation, mobility, arts and culture, and tried to pick apart which one of those was essential to us and how do we start to untangle these ideas of statistics. We focus particularly on justice and housing as the sort of tenets and weave these other ones into them through something we call the opportunity index. With everything, we had to start somewhere. We picked these indicators that are shown on the left here as the sort of core statistics, and there are a lot of sub-indicators that go into this. But I want to get to these maps that they're measured at the quarter-acre scale and start to reveal areas where there are potential to have these overlaps and ideas about statistics that say, focus your efforts on this particular topic in this area. This weaves in justice, this weaves in housing. If we look at all of these, it has all of those indicators spatially notated. We did this for justice, and then the sort of synthesis and sort of where we sit now is trying to understand which areas have certain influences and where to start to pull on these strings and untangle them a little more. our hope was that we'd pair this with the projects, the community projects, and start to understand where they intersect. We just finished a project maybe last week, so we haven't even begun that discussion yet. So this was also integrated into Linda's studio course, where they did some extensive mappings. This is one of maybe 100. But they looked at certain things as urban renewal in the city, understanding vacancy, and sort of where those overlap. And then also layering these into physical models and understanding how those are transcribed. I'll leave you with this. After a long discussion of all the statistics that we laid out, we still came to this idea of where do we add to the conversation of statistics and how does that intersect with people's lives. And so now we're embarking on how do we measure hope. And we've had a couple discussions on that, but that's sort of where we're launching into. And that's us thinking about how we do it.
Let's open to the floor. Perhaps we'll take a round of 3 questions and then throw it back to the panel and see if we do turn. So any questions?
Hi, so thank you for that. And I have a question to the last group, the measuring one question, so interesting. And I'm wondering if you thought at all about maybe collaborating with someone in philosophy, like PNP, to sort of think about, there are, theoretical frameworks where people think about hope. And so what kinds of humanistic discourses might contribute or help you think about the project?
Well, should we take that? It's a very nice question. It's hope. Epic, perhaps.
So we haven't quite gotten there yet, but we started on this idea of hope for 2 reasons. There was this sort of 2-part question that we started to took. One was, sort of, do you feel hopeful in that your situation will change? And then one, do you think that you have the power to do it? Those are the sort of 2 questions that we started with. I think that your suggestion of engaging with some folks in the philosophy department would be a good one. We just uncovered this a couple of weeks ago, so we haven't yet started on that.
Yeah, I think that would be a great addition. I do know that in one of our earlier discussions, positive psychology sort of came up and as a place to look, and the idea that there's been a lot of models and data around measuring hopelessness. So it would be great to sort of add to that repository and see where else we could be looking for.
Again, I'm struck, as I was at each panel, the ways in which people start as one thing and it's very bounded and then it ends, but it doesn't end. So I'm seeing that in all of these. So I guess I have a question just sort of about the afterlives and where do you see an end to this project? And then, Brian, I was also thinking about the ways in which, I thought your project was such a bounded project. It's a film festival. You show the films are over. Right? It's done. But then you film this interaction, and the interaction becomes a part of the archive. And so I'm just again struck by the multiple afterlives. So maybe you would like to talk about that.
So it's definitely true that we knew that there was a date in which we had to put on a show, and after the show was done, that is an essential part of what we're going to do. I think especially for Cinema St. Louis, they have to do this every year, so they have to kind of follow that schedule. I think one nice thing about having libraries involved is that we can kind of pick up from that and keep moving on. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in expanding sort of an oral history project there. Because I was aware of a couple of things while we were doing the film festival, and we were toying with that idea of oral history. So first of all, It's that idea that people that come to a particular film are coming because of that film. So by nature of that film, especially with the documentaries, there are going to be people that have that common interest and often have common experiences around that subject. You know, it's about education, they're passionate about that, maybe they have experiences in education, it's about the prison system, they've had experiences where they know someone, that's why they care. So built within that is a community of people that have stories that would all relate to one another, that if you grab them at that moment and make those connections, you can sort of build something from there. The other thing I was thinking about was particularly related to the crude idol streams. You know, we did crude idol with it more than one thing, where we saw the little clip of the oral history of the building. And the screening was a really interesting screening because it was half people that were sort of regular film festival goers. They were like, oh, I'm going to go watch a film about local history and then watch some of the film was made at the time. And then the other half were residents, and a good portion of those residents were actually family members and friends of Billy's in the town area. Billy lives in Oklahoma now, but some of the relatives are still here. And so for them, it was almost like watching a home movie. Like you could just hear them shouting at the screen, like, oh my God, I haven't seen Caribbean in 20 years. Oh, it was a really different experience for different people watching it. And it made me aware of like how families are collecting around these things. And I've done a couple other crude idol related screenings where that's happened, where you have these residents that all are interconnected. And so this isn't official. I'm trying to get together and pitch doing a crude idol oral history project that would be called Families of Crude Idol. With this sort of focus, we start, because I've identified in these screenings these different families that are all sort of connected, that have some common stories, but also have different experiences even though they're within the same family. Those families are usually pretty intimate with another family who they were close to at the time, who's then ended up with another family. And so there's kind of this web that you can sort of see developing with these people that are still engaged and passionate about that. So the idea would be to start engaging the oral histories around these sort of small family units and spread out there until you build the community of these family networks. And then possibly, this is tricky from an archival standpoint, if you ask people to contribute things, you can get a million things and you can't always keep them when they're not as useful. But maybe even having them each be able to contribute a folder or a box of stuff that represents their family and the time of crude idol, and build that as sort of a visual archive that with them getting to express themselves in the archive that way. So, that's something that's I'm still toying with. This has not been in any way approved, it's not actually happening yet, but I'd like to get off the ground. And it does kind of build off of this. Like it started with the screen and then moved on into this larger project that hopefully can have its own legs.
Yeah, where do you guys end?
Yeah, I think in all honesty, we'll have a better idea once we get a chance to sit down. Just got, all our events the communities were just wrapped up and just finished grading recently. So I think in the next few weeks we're going to sit down and just, we need to present a report to you guys anyway. So that's going to force us to think about what this work means. But I do know that a piece that we know for a while, we want to make sure we touch before we can say this is anywhere close to being done, is being able to disseminate this information and all this data back into the hands of the public and the community. So whatever form that takes, we don't know whether it's going to be in the form of an exhibition or something print-based or digital, but we do know that this belongs back into the community anyway. So we need to answer that question and then also put it back into our full classes.
And just to add on to that, we saw this as day one of many days. We knew that we were biting off a lot. But at the heart of this was a started conversation and dialogue about large infrastructural projects in the city. And how do you start to share these resources? How do you share the dialogue? We saw ourselves as a way to be a facilitator. So we were looking at ways to enable people in communities that are already embedded. We knew that we weren't embedded in any of these neighborhoods ourselves. So we provided economic resources and then sort of academic resources as well to people and sort of enable them to do work.
Take to Bruce.
Thanks. Just to follow on that, of course, one of the things that is very beautiful in all three of your projects is the role of the performance. almost at the extreme in the case of the festival in Philadelphia, and the performance of the screening of the film, and then performances that we saw in the videos. And it occurred to me that one of the great things about those often is that they go away, that they are performed and then they're gone. And there's something that I'm sure is a part of the enjoyment of those experiences that's related to the festival. Is to me a wonderful example of how that might be understood in a different way.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Green. I guess my question is kind of targeted to the gentleman that was talking about the oral history project. What is the end game of oral history? The end game. You talk about collecting this history. What is the end game, and how do they move the game forward into the present and then into the future?
Should we take these oral history and performance, beautiful Christians? Next one. Oh, sure.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I really like that our project is about sort of celebration of Black identity and Black heritage. And when I sat down, one of the other audience members commented to me that it looks like it was fun, and it is like a very fun project to work on. And as far as the future of the Odunde Festival, so it's over 40 years old now, but as I said in the presentation, Lois Fernandez died this year. And so the future of the festival is very uncertain, especially considering its embattled sort of position in the neighborhood. And there's this fear that if they do move it to another part of Philadelphia, it won't be as popular. And just to give you guys an idea, you saw Lois in the movie, but she is a force of nature and she had this huge personality, and even though her daughter, Boomy Fernandez, was really sort of the CEO of the festival for many years because Lois was sick, the sort of presence of Lois at the festival and in South Philadelphia and spearheading things like Ocean Village was really important to the festival. And Lois was, as I said, the first person nowhere married a natural. She also had 2 children out of wedlock, and at the time she did that, illegitimate children were issued short birth certificates, and so she fought to have them issued standard birth certificates, like children born in wedlock. She started her business, and then she fought for many years for the festival to stay in South Philadelphia. So she's very well known among the African American community in Philadelphia, and also very well known among the politicians there. So the festival it could be a fleeting thing. So that's another reason we're very happy about our recording it and recording that history of Philadelphia.
So yeah, for the end game for oral history, that's a big question. I'll try to address it in terms of some of the things that I've been thinking about. So I mean, especially since I'm a film geek and I'm a film guy in background, I'm pretty aware of the fact that when we make films and when you make a narrative from a film, that narrative tends to be pretty powerful. People really take that narrative, I don't want to say quite as gospel, but people will take it a lot more seriously, a lot more quickly. People will think that you made a definitive film about something. But a film is so limited in what it does. Those narratives are so simplified. They have to put it in an hour and a half. That it can be dangerous to let those films themselves be the thing that stands there. It's better if you make a film about a topic to then have lots of things like the whole history of other people with broad perspectives, with other interconnections that can show those other perspectives. I think Pruitt-Igoe is a great example of that. Pruitt-Igoe was defined by the media representation for many years. Now a lot more people are talking about the resident's perspective and how it was a lot more complex. And that's a very good conversation to be having. So oral histories can serve that function of making available those other voices and then sort of filling in a lot of those blanks. The one thing that I'm also aware of, though, is that it can also become, the university comes and does oral histories, asks the questions they want, etc. So one thing that would be nice, ideally, and
I was kind of hinting at it as a possible idea when I thought it'd be nice to include some production component in the festival, just sort of dealing some with that. It's like one of the things we could do is be training people in doing their own oral histories, so that they can be going out in the community and talking to people that they know and helping to build the stories. So it's not just us who's generating that content and generating the questions, but then have a place where there's oral histories to then come to, and that other people have the skills to start making their own media with it. So, I mean, of course, oral history is supposed to help document history that we don't otherwise have, but it would be nice, these could be opportunities to allow more people to do that, and then have one central place, like here, where you then have them all so people would know where to come and find them if they wanted to do research.
We didn't necessarily collect oral histories, but the idea that we were having people that were trustworthy in the neighborhood go talk to their own residents, and then bringing those perspectives back to the agencies that were planning was a big component of ours. So my state is collecting their own data, but they were collecting it in sort of forums like this, where people are presenting to people. It allowed the conversation to be a little different. So we, again, were sort of intermediaries between allowing citizens to voice their perspectives to people that they trusted, and then connecting those to people that are actually building infrastructure.
We're going to wind up there. We're going to go into the next session soon, which I think many questions will arise out of these three sessions. We can take it further. But I'm very struck, and thank you all to all the presenters, of the sort of similarities to the context in which I work. I mean, the question of oral history was presented as the answer to the post-apartheid kind of erasure of certain voices. And it's a question that is coming up time and time again in the South African context. And I'm so pleased to hear it raised here as well. I mean, the question of the sort of performance of Africanness and stuff as well, maybe in a sense, is there life after the death of the person who constructed the performance? I don't know. And then again, the sort of incredible kind of connections to the idea of infrastructure, Rosenwood, IGO example, and in your mobility questions to a city like Johannesburg in South Africa. I wouldn't go so far as saying it's universal, but the sort of parallels of division are very striking. So thank you all so very much.
Thanks, Gene. And for those of you that may have just joined us this afternoon, I'm Gene Ullman, the Director of the Center for Humanities. My name is Bruce Lindsay. I'm a professor in architecture in the Santa Clara School, and also the co-PI along with Gene for the provided city initiative. I think with just a little bit of arrangement, we can turn some chairs and kind of look to the middle, and we don't have to be lined up in front. And I've got a few notes just to reflect on the last 2 days, and I think hearing from you all will be really an exciting part of the conclusion of our day. I was curious about the thought question. Did you have other thoughts about oral histories and what it might be?
Again, my name is Robert Curry, and I grew up in Port Island, so when you said oral history in Port Island, I was like, okay, I have to access this question. In fact, I'm going to the 43rd annual Port Island reunion tomorrow night. And one of the things that I'm going to introduce to some people there is exactly to talk about recording history and starting that whole process. Because we've been having our reunion since the project closed in 74, but we haven't recorded anything. Of course, I have recorded my history, and I'm kind of a historian of sort. So when the gentleman starts talking about oral history, that's just like, boom, we need to connect. Because he probably can be helpful to the endeavor that I'm going to pursue. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to introduce to the folks at the reunion that we need to start recording our history so the story can be told from our point of view. Because oftentimes it's not told from our point of view. It's told, and that's a good thing. In fact, gentleman by the name of Lee Rainwater, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Lee Rainwater. He was a Washington University professor, and he wrote a book called Behind Get a Wall, which I read numerous times. You've written it. It's a very excellent book. But again, then Bob Hansen just came out with his book. But I think the narrative needs to come from the people who live in the community. And so when the gentleman came up with the question about oral history, I think that's a good idea.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. And thank all of you. Thanks to all of you for joining us until this afternoon. It's been a great couple of days, and I was reflecting on not only the last 2 days and the projects that we've seen and heard about, but also thinking back 4 years when we started the Divided City Initiative, knowing that the faculty collaborative grants was really going to be one of the key efforts of our work together. Believing that the research around the 3 themes of curricular development, collaborative research, and community engagement would be broadly interpreted. And I guess for me, the last 2 days have inspired me in seeing how they're also interwoven in the various projects. And I think that was a great thing to see, where in the sort of distinctions between a course and a project and a community method or form of research was very fluid. Just for fun, I thought I would start off with what might be the beginnings of an urban humanities dictionary. A few years ago, I became acutely aware of my own disciplinary jargon. And this happens a lot in final reviews where architecture faculty and guests sit there and preside over the presentation of students' projects. And the language is pretty arcane often, and so I started collecting those words. But over the last couple of days, there were some really interesting ones that I wanted to just share with you for a second. More or less in chronological order, but the urban humanities and the rural humanities. We had a member talk to us who's the head of the art of the rural. Cultural normativity. That's a new one. That's a pretty interesting one, I think. Landscape exhibition unit. We saw a picture of what that looks like. Spatial analysis, of course. Enlightened humanism. These are quotes, by the way. Enlightened humanism. That one struck me as, that's cool, but then isn't humanism enlightened? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe that could be a question. Spatial sonics. Activist scholars and cultural activists. That came up several times, and I never thought about an activist scholar. I probably should have thought of activist scholar or cultural activist. Spatial forgetfulness and spatial rearranging. That's what made me think we could just adjust our chairs just a little bit. And I think both of those get into the prevalence of maps. And a number of years ago when I was at Auburn, I was beginning to learn about the field of landscape architecture, where mapping is such an important method and a long-standing skill that's part of the landscape architect's education. Our architecture students were discovering mapping, and the landscape students would tease the architecture students by telling them it's napping, not mapping. So spatial forgetfulness, spatial rearranging, urban citizenship. I've heard variations of that. One of my mentors talked about citizen architects. Society equals cities. That one came up in various ways in a couple of places. Civic religion. And then I was struck by one phrase that Mark used this afternoon, but I've heard variations of it for a long time, especially since I've been a part of the Urban Humanities Initiative in the Divided City in particular. He said, I'm a historian by training. And I've heard that a lot, that historians are trained. And I think we think that architects are educated. So I didn't know if there was a difference, or if it was just maybe I'm being silly, but I've heard it now for a few times, and it's actually influenced me to say that in several occasions I have said I am an architect by training. So I don't know what that means. But One of the things I think, too, Gina and I have talked a little bit about how we really need your help to think about the next 4 years going forward. But I wanted to mention a couple of things that I think, again, came through many of the presentations that we've seen over the last 2 days. For us as designers and architects, the idea of a project is very natural to us. But I think I would be fair to say that almost every presentation talked about whether it was a course or a community engagement or a scholarship or a research project, that it was described as a project. That's a particular way of framing things. And it got me thinking about, in relationship to a question Jean asked earlier about the way in which our various disciplines influence our pedagogy. Jean reflected on the idea that design is influencing some pedagogy in the humanities, or the way we think about it. And I was asking the question of how does it work the other way? And it occurred to me that in teaching design, there's a very different relationship between pedagogy and practice. We teach like we practice almost. And I think that's different in the humanities. And I'm excited about that difference. And I think perhaps it was an undercurrent of some of the ways that we saw our partners in our projects talk about the work. Of course, there were also partners in almost every project. And I would say that there was a prevalence of a sort of gravity towards a particular kind of engagement that was similar, community engagement. And it, of course, was across different kinds of communities. And I suspect very different definitions of what community is. Perhaps we could say they were defined by the outcomes of the projects, but maybe not. I think having a sense of how that both is something we share, but also something that we need to understand more clearly came through, I think, in the various projects. And then, of course, the discussion almost since the beginning yesterday of both the role in the future, but also the responsibility of archives. I think Jean and I were asking the question, where does the work go? What is the life after the project? How does the project, what's the afterlife of the project? In some cases, very few cases, I would say, there was a sense of clarity about it ends here. And I think that's related to the kind of responsibility that the kind of gravity towards engagement and the kinds of ideas and research topics that are being explored necessitate that question and kind of make it difficult to say that it ends here. And so we would like your help with that. In thinking about the next 4 years, we're confident that we're going to be funded again through the Mellon to continue this. And so I would no jinxes, knock on wood, let's knock on wood. Yes.
Somebody knock real hard, please say.
Yeah. So we would like to ask you 2 questions, and then we would also welcome comments and observations about the projects, between the projects. I want to know more about the reunion. That sounds amazing. And also just thoughts that you may have over just the 2 days specifically. But the 2 questions are, if it is an archive, how can we facilitate that? Where would it be? How would we do that? The archive in the sense of not only a response to the responsibility of the work that we've begun, but as a resource for research and for future projects. And then the other is, what can the thing of the Divided City Initiative offer to help facilitate your work? So, yes.
And then just general questions or observations about the current.
My name is Lloyd Kleindens, and I had been an adjunct professor here back in the 70s, methods of foreign language teaching, when I was the graduate of the Institute of Education before it got monetized and devalued. I come from Franklin County, and what I'm looking for is a cooperative effort to respond to the 3 Thursdays ago, the opening of the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Franklin County has one of those columns in that monument where I come from. And St. Louis has one listed. I'm sure there are many more. But I've been in touch with them, and we can claim those monuments, and we have a place to bring them back into our county. We intend to have it, we hope, for our bicentennial in 2019, next to or on the other side of the old courthouse for the Benjamin Franklin statue on Origins. My thought is to have the one in the city. I thought of even a double divide monument. The north-south Delmar Drive, and the east-west St. Louis County City divide. That would be right around the Regional Arts Commission or so, that coordinate. And I think it would be very powerful. There are no other counties in our area that are proximate to us. So it's really St. Louis County, or St. Louis, and Franklin County. But I'm looking for an effort to kind of go to that office, the Equal Justice Initiative, and bring those steel columns back. And I'm looking for a partnership and seeing that happen. So I'll put it out there for something very specific, but highly symbolic. Thank you.
Thanks. I wasn't aware of that aspect of the museum. The columns can be brought back to their original site and get commemorating them.
There's a stacked pile of proof.
Just an anecdote about that. I'm very proud of the fact that one of our alums was the project architect for that memorial, Alicia Ajay. And she, along with the architecture firm Mass Architects out of Boston, were the designers of that. Which I hear is just unbelievably powerful. Other thoughts? By the way, you remind me that we haven't yet effectively figured out a good way of networking or putting people and projects together that might not know each other directly.
So I feel like I'm stating the obvious maybe, but one of the things that's become that I'm thinking that could happen in another iteration of the grant would be for the Divided Cities initiative to take a kind of leadership role here at WashU in terms of figuring out how all of this can be curated. How all of this research and everything that's produced can be curated. So not simply just the projects kind of on the website, but there are some, one of the things as somebody who's doing oral history now, I think about a lot is that there's all kinds of oral history that's being done on this campus, much of it about kind of social justice and urban humanities topics, and it's scattered and we don't know about it, and the library is kind of starting to think about, well, how can we support this? But it would be wonderful if there was kind of a portal for showcasing all of the work that these projects are doing in oral history, but that other courses are doing and other departments and faculty are doing as well. And I think that could extend to other ways in which the projects out of the Divided Cities Initiative could be grouped together, could be related to each other, so they're kind of more of a kind of curation of all of this work, either on your website or somebody, I can't remember who was talking about the University of Chicago ago, creating this, was that David Cunningham? I can't remember who that was. This morning about kind of creating online labs. It seems to me that this is a group that could, try to help people pull together to think about how Washington could do those kinds of things.
I think that curation is a better word than archiving. I think we're actually talking about the same thing. And I think initially we thought that the website that we have up there, we imagined that was where all that was going to happen. But the amount of material and the ranges of types of material, which if you've been with us for both days, you're just like, oh my gosh, it far exceeds what we imagined, or our abilities to kind of handle it as non-experts in that sort of stuff. So I think we need to have some conversations with the library, with people with some expertise with web design and communications, and to think about what would be, because it isn't just the divided city, you're right, there are other parts of the campus that are doing related things, but even just to get our stuff kind of under control, because it has these afterlives that were unanticipated, but are actually the kind of the most interesting part of what we've done. Other thoughts? With that microphone? Yeah, normally.
Just a question that you posed in the beginning of your first round is, are you going to go beyond St. Louis?
Everybody hear the question? Are you going to go beyond the hood?
Because we started, it was St. Louis and the world, and looking at segregation, division, difference in urban space, locally and globally. And we became, for very good reasons, very locally focused, I think, after August 2014. So one question is, in the next iteration, do we stick with the neighborhood, or do we expand? Yeah, there's somebody.
I was wondering, Alvin suggested yesterday that you were trying to, with the segregation, create a graduate certificate or a minor in urban humanities. And I think from that position, that would be a good center for to further the project. Yes, the divided city, but understanding urban humanities, which is at the bottom line of this, and maybe developing more courses, interdisciplinary courses, not only what Professor Wanzo has been trying to suggest in different ways, like literary escapes of the world or artistic escapes, and really trying to intersect humanities and landscape, the idea of escapes that's so fertile for thinking. And there's so much, with dwelling on the futures and all these projects, there's so much places anchor this kind of urban humanities idea. I think that would be a great anchor point for the project, that about the city and the idea of urban humanities as something, as a space in Washington University.
Please say go beyond the hood. Go beyond the hood. What's the connotation beyond the hood?
I actually said St. Louis.
Oh, I thought you said that.
Beyond St. Louis.
Beyond St. Louis.
Right.
Oh, I thought you said beyond the hood.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Absolutely go beyond St. Louis. I would just say that. Absolutely.
I don't know if it was brought up yesterday, but the Pierce report was at the mid-90s on St. Louis, which recommended a much larger concept of greater St. Louis, and the notion of a regional a regional community rather than the urban, suburban, rural. And coming from Franklin County, what a rich opportunity. One of my fantasies is an educational system that would go up and down Highway 44 so that children throughout their education could could have that urban, suburban, rural experiences by a more kind of extended neighborhood interaction.
I think this particular question was animated by the fact that our original proposal had an international, it was St. Louis, but then it had an international focus. But because of events in the wake of, well, during and in the wake of Ferguson, we became very local in our questions, which I think positioned us actually to ask much more interesting questions of places that we were outside of this larger metropolitan area. Terrence?
So I do want to return for a second back to the question of curation, because I also think what I found really interesting about projects is that some projects seem to be doing different things. Some wanted to be pedagogical for like K through 12. Some were community engaged, and I think there's a question about where does information get held, and is WashU always the place, and is there a space to have, depending on the type of project, community archives? Because if you're thinking about community members getting access to knowledge, to use this knowledge to do work, particularly activist communities or nonprofits who have to make certain types of claims, how do you, on a project by project basis that have different politics, how do you make that accessible? And so I think that curation writ large, and then a curation also attentive to the particular politics of and there's a lot of work about developing community archives.
Yeah, I wondered if you guys, because you're probably thinking about that at this very moment.
Yeah, like that's our big next, hopefully, step is, you know, I think in a lot of ways when we task, when we partner with our community partners, we ask them to make sure that they disseminate their findings back into their communities. So they did it, and in a lot of ways I'm like, oh my goodness, we need to like do what they did. We need to do what we asked them to do, and I think in some ways there's something of a model there. I think that's what we're asking of ourselves, because we built this repository of information that takes on so many shapes, and it's our desire to see that coexist in the community, but I feel like that in some ways might require another level of partnership with people in the communities to curate something together versus we sit down and make it happen and put it in there versus how about we come together and forge this thing and create this thing.
We had to be very mindful of politics and power when we were doing this, and so had it be portrayed as something WashU was doing, as something that the community groups were doing, it would be a very different dynamic. So we were trying to make sure that we bring resources, but also this sort of partnership that allows that community organization to keep going. So we want to see if maybe we continue our partnership with the three groups and disseminate information that way. But so we had part of the MOU requirement was that they would host an event in the spot that they did the survey. There had to be a spatial component, there had to be a performance part of it. But again, it was just a day-long episode. So if people were unavailable that day, how do we bring it back?
Did I read correctly or hear you correctly in understanding that you guys have essentially started a consulting company? Yes? Yeah? No, but you did talk about, I think I heard an aspiration of your work influencing the various other actors in this drama, right? Through presenting alternative metrics and stories from people that aren't being listened to in the process.
Yeah, I think in our proposal we actually do say that our hope is that we will propose a new model that provides sort of like a new approach to engaging residents who, you know, might not be heard. So I think everyone wrote that down.
Well, just remember that we'll negotiate our percentage of the first meeting. We're invited to.
Liz?
Hi, Liz. Hi. I think one thing that maybe is coming up for me in this conversation about where does the work get created and how does the community access the work is that we don't necessarily, in the academy I'll go see community partners, and they will literally pull student projects off the shelf exactly as they've been handed to them on the last day of the semester. And they're like, look at this amazing work that these students did. Isn't this an incredible plan? And the translation of the student work, the sort of interpretation that we do at the academic level, doesn't get to like, how do I do this thing? What do I do with all this information, and how do I use it? So I've been doing a project in my office for the last year to try and figure out how can we take all of our studio work and just make it accessible, just so the community can come and see what did we do, not just having to come to review and listen to the panel and use jargon words to talk about the student work, but to actually look at the pictures and really think about them outside of the academic context. So I'd be really interested in seeing the Divide and See project in the next phase, help everybody who's working in it think about that translation and how do we do that, not just the place, as you mentioned, but also what's the language that we use, how is it presented, and how do we help the community understand the words that we use in the academy, because I think in some ways that does give them access to money and power that we have access to that maybe people in the community don't. So I'm interested in a little bit more of like what happens next and how does the community become part of that for people who are engaged in these projects.
Just to build on that, so I'm thinking that I talked about curation, but there's lots of different pieces of this process. So there's translation, there's preservation, and there's curation, and there are probably other pieces as well. But yeah, so like coming up with ways to think about all of those things together.
This may be stating the obvious, but we were struggling with time. Because three of us didn't necessarily have dedicated courses that we would put this into. So this was an extra job that we were able to take on and willing to take on, but there was a sort of time crunch. We were left with things that we were imagining that we would get to that we just didn't have the capacity to do the project justice.
Well, on that front, when we, again, not knowing, when we imagined this, it's like, we'll have these grants. And actually, Rebecca was the brain behind the sort of architecture of the three grants. And I think that it was brilliantly conceived. But what we didn't realize is that none of this stuff could really get done in a year. So we thought that the project coordinator, Tila, would, she'd have her 4 for this year, and then they'd be done, and then 4 more would come on board, but in fact, she had 4, and then she had 8. Right, so it was cumulative because none of them really kind of fully ended. And now, as I've listened, these past 2 days, I see that's because, in fact, they don't have clear endpoints, and I think that Bruce is sort of right. It's partly due to the fact that they're engaged with sort of really important social, political questions that it's hard to say, and now we're done, because we're not. So, yeah, time.
Yeah, I just have a question. It's more directed maybe at those of you who are postdocs or assistant professors or grad students. Do you feel like you're getting any credit for this? Because I'm an associate professor and was when I applied, and so I did not have the fear of, oh, this is going to take time away from my important peer-reviewed tenure-getting project. But I'm not sure that in my department this would have helped me all that much with that process. And I'm wondering, is that a concern for any of us? And if so, is there anything we can do at the university or I suppose the university, College of Arts and Sciences, Sam Fox level, to persuade the tenure and promotion board, let's say, that this kind of thing should matter as much as a peer-reviewed article in a journal?
That's a great question.
Can I ask first, because I feel like for the Sam Fox folks, I feel like there's a way in which these projects translate. So I mean, I think that's part of what why I sort of, wish, the curricular grant and that you were able to buy yourself out of a course for this, like for humanists, so it can be embedded when we don't have that, particularly since humanists sort of have to figure out, like, no, this can be for them, and to provide a space for them when their chairs may not figure out what it does. It provides a space on that front. And I do worry about that some of the faculty, the junior faculty who may be doing some of the most interesting cutting edge stuff like in relationship to these issues, this is just not legible. So I do think, particularly I guess on the humanities faculty front, trying to construct spaces, because I don't think we are going to be able to change the tenure requirements. But can we, at all? But I mean, can we, shape, can someone be brought up in a course? Can people, how do we embed things or just have some piece of it that can then count as a publication in some way? I think that that's important in the next generation to sort of help, again, humanists figure out that they have a place in the project.
Yeah, that's great. Just, I think one hope that we have is in building on the success that I think what we could safely say is the early success of our student cohorts through their summer research grants, that the certificate program in the urban humanities is going to be an important part of that, figuring out that gateway for the humanities students and faculty especially. And I'm excited about that opportunity. During some of the other presentations, I caught myself while, even though I've known about each of the projects, I haven't always seen them, and I was thinking, how did I miss the film series completely? And I'm thinking that if we go forward, one of the things we're going to do is to try to strengthen during the semester city seminar presentations. So that they happen maybe twice a semester rather than once a semester. There'll be an opportunity for us to have energizing moments of hearing what's going on like these, in the course of the year and not at the end of the year. So, but the question about the tenure promotion and postdocs is an interesting one. It's actually being discussed at the university level relative to community engagement. Some universities have specific guidelines in their tenure and promotion guidelines that describe how community engagement is a part of, can be a part of a tenure case. And this has come up through the diversity steering committee and the diversity report that Adrian Davis has led that effort. And so those conversations are happening. My hope is that they will lead to an addition to the tenure and promotion guidelines that shows how a faculty member can that it is a tenurable activity.
I guess, yeah, that's what I'm wondering about. I mean, because as tenure and promotion are handled in my department, at least, it would be reckless of me to advise a junior professor to do this for a semester instead of churn out a journal article to work in the book, which stinks because, as Rebecca said, junior professors are often the ones who are likely to do the most interesting, creative stuff. So it seems if there's a way to make this part of, if there's a way to make the various parts of the university work together, and that's probably it. I've worked here long enough to know that's kind of a crazy thing to expect, but that would be nice. Yeah, so it's encouraging to hear what you're saying.
Yeah. We also, one good thing, we have other models that exist in other universities where that's the case, and that makes it a good argument. And the Gephardt, having been involved with the Gephardt for quite a while, it's also the case that for that reason, when you look at the community engagement efforts and courses and projects around the university, there's a very large participation of adjunct faculty. And it doesn't mean that there aren't always, there isn't any tenure faculty, but the majority of that work is being done by adjuncts.
I've been engaged in this, so I've had a curious research journey through architecture and then into the humanities. And I've been on endless panels about how to turn, how creative work can be turned into research. And in the institute that I run, we decided to just do it. So we peer review every exhibition, we peer review every performance, and we've got the reports, and we've actually, so instead of debating how it might be different to the scientific model with its community engagement group, we've actually got a double blind, we've got someone in our institute who manages the double-blind peer review process, who will ask Jeans and Drover as an exhibition to peer review it. And So we sort of decided to take that very seriously. The university didn't know how to deal with it, but they could deal with the maths theorem versus the monographs. And we could actually just assert that the architectural plan, the performance, the artwork, the exhibition had academic value. So I don't know if that's, and it was a chutzpah, but it actually it did work for us, which is great. And then my other point is that I'm just sitting there thinking this is so I can see all these projects are ongoing and there's incredible effort that goes into this kind of work. But for me, there's a moment that might be marked through something like a book that I would certainly grab to show to my students. I mean, I've been taking notes of every video, and I'd love to find, if there was a divided cities, rethinking St. Louis or thinking St. Louis differently or something. Books of it. I think there's a place for those kinds of things, and I think there's just a place for an argument about how you all thought this notion of division, and maybe across your three categories. It's easy sitting there. You know you're going to be one of the double blind reviews. So Bruce, any last comments? Maybe we should let people go home.
Yeah,
Friday, TG, I have.
Any last comments? Thanks to Nolene. She's been a wonderful partner in our efforts almost since the beginning, and thanks for coming so far to be with us and to offer your amazing thoughts. And then, of course, we wouldn't have made it 4 years without Tila's help and her coordination, but more than that, often she's the first person that talks to our faculty and our students, and her ability to convey the aspirations of what we have seen over the last 2 days is fundamental to where we are today. So thank you, Tila, very much.